Something we've kind of skipped over in the lessons so far is that after somebody purchases tickets successfully, we're not actually returning them anything meaningful in the JSON response. We're just kicking back this sort of empty array with no information. Typically, when you would make a request to a JSON endpoint like this one, where we're trying to post a new order to this orders endpoint, you would usually get back a response that contains information about the order that was just created. So I'd like to update our test a little bit to account for what we might expect here and talk a little bit about how you can make assertions against JSON responses in Laravel. So let's scroll back down to our test here and look at where we might add this assertion. So I think underneath this line where we're asserting that we're getting back a 201, we might want to make some assertions about the data that we actually got back in the response. So let's think a little bit about what we might want to get back. I think at its most basic level, it would be nice to get back like maybe the email address of the customer. So we might have email john@example.com. The ticket quantity that is associated with that order, so we know how many tickets were purchased. So in this case, it would be 3 again. And we might even want to include like the total amount that the customer was charged. So maybe like amount is $97.50, like we're asserting down here. So if we wanted to assert that this was the sort of response structure that we got back from our app, how could we do it? Well, out of the box, Laravel provides a few different JSON assertions. So one of them is called CJSON equals. So we can do this CJSON equals, and this is going to verify that the response that came back from whatever request we made matches this expected result exactly. So we'll kind of fake it for a second. I'll kind of show you what I mean here. Let's just copy this, and in our controller here, let's just paste it in and fix this indentation and maybe put a little bit of space around this so we can see what's going on. If we go back and just run this one test, you'll see that it should in fact pass because the JSON matches exactly. Now, if we were to go to a controller and make a little change here, like maybe we actually were only kicking back 2 tickets instead of 3, you'll see that CJSON equals actually fails in this case because it's trying to compare the entire encoded JSON string, and it's noticing that they don't quite match because of the 3 in this case and the 2 in this case. So let's quickly fix that again and make sure that our test is back to passing so that we have a good reference point going forward. And we're still green. So this is pretty useful in a lot of situations, but there's one common case I run into a lot where this isn't quite right. Imagine that our concert orders controller was not only just returning this data, but it was also returning maybe like an ID or some other information that we don't totally care about. Like maybe it's also returning like created at timestamp, and this is 2015, 01, 01, 12, 12, 54 or whatever, just some random data that doesn't actually matter for our assertion, but does come back in the response because we're kind of returning a more detailed response than is actually required by the tests. Now, if we were to go back and run this test, we're going to see that now it will fail because now the expected response and the actual response aren't exactly identical. So we can get around this by using another JSON assertion. Laravel provides another one called CJSON contains out of the box. So let's run this and you'll see that this one does in fact pass in this case. So you may be thinking, great, CJSON contains. That sounds like one that I would probably use most often. And now you can actually also just use CJSON in Laravel, which is kind of a shortcut for try CJSON equals first, and if that fails, then try CJSON contains. So you see in this case, if we just use CJSON, that will also get a passing test, which is pretty cool. Now the deceiving thing about this though is it might not be working exactly how you think. If I was to go to the concert orders controller here and make a little change, or maybe I added another key, something like foo, and I stuck the email address in this foo key instead of having it out at the top level, you would probably expect that this test would now fail. But check out what happens when I run it. The test still passes. That's a little bit peculiar, isn't it? The reason that it's still passing is because CJSON contains isn't checking to see if the JSON that comes back contains this whole structure. Instead, it's checking every key value pair independently and checking, is this key value pair present anywhere in the response? And in this case, it is present. It's just present down here. Now it checks, is this one present in the response? And it sees, oh yes, it's present in the response. It's just here. So while the CJSON contains assertion can be helpful in a lot of cases, because of this behavior, I actually personally try to avoid it. And there's one other JSON assertion that Laravel provides that's sort of a hidden, undocumented gem that I'd like to tell you a bit about here. And this one is called CJSON subset. So check out what happens if I run this test. So now this test fails because we failed to find this array as a subset of the response that came back. If we go back to our controller and we fix this kind of extra key that we added to get back to our original response and run this test again, now this test passes. So it passes under the conditions that we want it to pass, and it fails under the conditions where we wanted CJSON contains to fail, even though it didn't. So for my money, CJSON subset is the assertion that you can basically use for anything all the time. For me, it's basically always the right one. And it can even do some pretty cool stuff that's not really related to what we're going to test here, but I want to talk about it a bit anyways. Imagine we had a different sort of response coming back. I'm just going to duplicate this and comment this one out. Imagine rather than just like a single entity that was coming back, maybe we were getting back like 3 customers. Maybe we had an endpoint that returned all the customers for a concert or something. So maybe we had this structure coming back where there's an array, and each array contained like an object here, and each object was a person. So maybe we have John, Jane, and Jim. And now if we go to our controller, and maybe we'll copy this into our controller here to replace this version, and quickly fix this indentation. Now, of course, if we run this test, we would expect it to pass because they are identical. So let's just run that and double check. And it does pass. But check out what happens if I add some extra metadata to each item. Like say maybe every single one here had an ID, and the ID was, like some random number or whatever. If I save this and head back to our test and run it again, you'll see that even this test still passes, because the way CJSON subset is working is it's just trying to check if I take this array and I overlay it on top of this array, matching up all the keys that are present in this one, are the values the same? It ignores any fields that are present in the actual response that aren't present here. The only time it'll fail is if there is a field here that is also in here, but it's different. So for example, if I was to say that, we expected this person to have an ID of 4, we're going to see that this does in fact pass because we do have 4 set in this one. So let's just run it and see. So it does pass, but if we had the next person and maybe we wanted their ID to be 5, but right now in the actual implementation it's still coming back as 4, you'll see that this does fail. So like I said before, CJSON subset to me is a magical assertion. This is the one that I always reach for, and this is the one that we're going to be using for the most part when we're trying to make assertions about JSON in this course. In the next lesson, we're going to go back to this assertion that we were working on here and actually run this test and work towards getting this functionality implemented.